I have to hand it to the indie scene sometimes. They can start from ridiculous premises and make it work somehow. Imagine a game that takes a roguelite and mashes it together with a card game and an auto battler. Then add base building with resource collection in this whole pot for good measure. Just look at how ridiculous this concept sounds like. And you know what? Loop Hero makes this whole thing work. For the most part. This channel might give a wrong impression regarding my gaming habits. I've sunk a lot of hours into roguelites over the years. The better ones focus on game design and mechanics, so they tend to hook me in. It also helps that they can be played in short sessions, so you don't always need to commit a lot of time to have a good experience. Hell, during my work breaks I prefer playing them over more mainstream titles because of this. Just pop into a roguelite, play the crap out of it for an hour, and when the break ends just shut it off and get back to what pays the bills. Loop Hero is one of those games. It's even better in the sense that it can be paused or saved at any point in time. Its options menu even goes further and offers a plethora of quality of life features in this sense. Basically, at every gameplay transition point you can auto pause. It's so convenient that you can even play it during work hours, whenever you're waiting for that thing to process or that mail to be answered. You know very well what I'm talking about. You're able to pause or exit the game instantly whenever you need to get back to whatever you're supposed to be doing. You can go into a fight and let it finish in the background, knowing that it instantly pauses after it ends because you checked that option. So, in the sense of an everyday experience that requires little focus or attention, Loop Hero is a perfect fit. I know it's a weird thing to open my review with, but I think it's an important distinction to make right out of the gate. This isn't a hardcore roguelite like Noita, Dead Cells or Enter the Gungeon, where you must sweat for every bit of progress. Their depth and complexity are also why I don't usually cover roguelites over here, as much as I enjoy playing them. I'd feel too bad to cover games without exploring every facet of their mechanics, which in some cases involves more than 100 hours of gameplay. Here, after playing roughly 45 hours, I think I have a complete picture. So how does Loop Hero measure up? Let's start at the beginning. The basics of the game are something like this. You are in a world that gets consumed and replaced with the void by a mysterious force, and the hero you control intends to recreate what once was. It's a very bleak introduction and I absolutely love it. It helps that the music in the entire game is excellent, especially when conveying this feeling of endless emptiness. So how are we supposed to help our hero undo all of this? Well, strap on, because it's a bit more complicated to put in words than it actually is. I'll have to be a bit more descriptive than I usually am, but I'll leave my thoughts along the way, so bear with me. So, your character goes on a randomly generated path whenever you start a run. Yes, it's a looped circuit, so don't ever say that the game or my video titles are misleading. On this path, you get to fight monsters that spawn periodically, or more precisely, the hero fights automatically since the game's an auto battler, as I mentioned earlier. Each enemy killed rewards you with resources, equipment or items you can place on the map. The latter allows you to populate the world with mob spawns or landscape items that offer modifiers for your hero or opponents. Some can also be combined to generate different effects of entirely new tiles. The stuff you can place on the map contribute to filling this bar, which triggers a boss spawn. The selection of map items you can use is generated from a deck of cards you create before starting the run. The equipment you gather can buff various stats of your hero. The resources you collect can be used in the camp to build new buildings between runs and help you unlock new cards to place on your deck, new classes, or provide permanent buffs to your hero. Sounds simple enough, isn't it? So the first thing you'll encounter is a deck building part of the game. Before starting each run, you get to choose what to include since you have a deck size limit. You also have to consider that some cards interact with each other. During the session, the cards you get are of course random, so the order in which you populate the map is more or less at RNG's mercy, not like it matters too much anyway. What counts is that the system works and is reasonably complex overall. You can do many things to improve your runs, and the deck building is pretty competent at providing the tools to do it. It doesn't have a wide variety of cards you can choose from, but the unique interactions can create some neat strategies. For instance, you can put a vampire's manor right next to a village to spawn guaranteed mobs for 3 loops, after which, whenever you pass through, it offers a more potent healing boost compared to one without an undead caretaker. Also, you want to take what's helpful for your chosen class only. Yes, there are classes, I'll get to them later, but know that some buildings can be either a must-have or a total liability depending on what class you chose. The map items and enemies you get to spawn are decided not solely on how strong they are, but the resources they generate as well. Each monster has a different type of resource they drop when they are killed, and the same goes for each tile you pass through. You can take all that sweet loot home if you make it out alive, and it's essential for the camp building component. Here you can unlock things in something akin to a tech tree, with rewards such as new classes, buffs for your hero, new cards to add to your deck, or increasing your camp's inventory space for items. The latter part is relatively straightforward. There are items you can pick up on your travels that give you passive buffs when equipped in the camp. Most of them are straight buffs, and the only thought process is to choose whichever you squeeze in the limited space you've got at your disposal. The building progression I've mentioned is pretty linear. By the end, it incentivizes grinding more than anything else due to how expensive stuff becomes. You might also think that if the positioning of things is important during a session, the same should apply to whatever you build in the camp. Well, that's not the case. Only a couple of items are location dependent, such as the forests or lumberjacks' huts, while the rest can be built wherever you want. This is the first clue that the game is slightly deceptive. Remember this for later. After choosing your deck, you get to select the chapter you want to start with. The game has 4, the first 3 have a unique boss and include several additional rules to increase difficulty. Stuff like increased power growth with each completed loop and more abilities, even if some of them make fights easier. The 4th chapter is more remarkable in the sense that you get to confront each of the 3 bosses alongside a final showdown with the big bad, alongside a lot more drops than the other chapters. This makes the option to play the previous chapters pointless, unfortunately. After unlocking all 4, there's no reason to return to any of the first 3. It's nice to get the choice, but it's a false one, mainly since the 4th chapter allows for infinite resource accumulation, making it by far the best one to farm resources for your camp building plans. And finally we get to the combat part. As I mentioned, it's an auto battler, and I say it's pretty competent at what it does despite its simplicity. Your hero attacks enemies at random, loot drops, you get cards you can use to populate the map, and with each completed loop you get better and better equipment. Here things get more interesting because each class plays quite a bit different game. The warrior is just a regular guy with a weapon, a shield and a piece of armor. He plays a standard game according to the scenario I just mentioned. The rogue on the other hand gives up on the shield for an extra weapon, but what's most interesting is how he gets his equipment. Instead of obtaining it from dead enemies, the rogue takes trophies from his victims. Once he reaches the campfire at the end of each loop, he trades them, and his inventory is filled with a random assortment of items of various rarities and types, with their power level depending on how many trophies he collected. This is one example of why you want to add the outpost card in your deck when playing with this class, because it usually takes any uncommon item that drops in fights where you receive their backup. But since the rogue only takes trophies, this downside is cancelled. Last but but not least, the Necromancer wields a grimoire instead of a weapon and summons skeletons to fight for him. Of course, this makes for a radically different gameplay style due to how distinct combat is with a small army of skeletons helping the hero. As a cool twist, using an outpost doesn't grant you the help of a knight because they're so disgusted by what you are that they pepper the entire battlefield with arrows, hitting everyone on the field. Despite the variation, I feel that there's room for more classes that can switch up the game's rules even further for exciting scenarios. Logically, all this comes with the added distinction of equipment providing a different kind of attributes for each class. The warrior has a more considerable emphasis on defense, counters, vampirism and the like. The rogue focuses more on high attack damage, evasion and critical damage, while the necromancer has multiple skills to buff his skeleton army and easy access to a magical shield to protect his frail body. All these can be buffed with the help of equipment you keep gathering along the way. This is one of the two things where your decisions significantly impact the outcome of your adventures and are by far the most complex. You have lots of stats to consider, and choosing the right one to prioritize can make or break a run most of the time, but here the game is again deceptive. Mark this one down as well. But I have to criticize the way the information is conveyed. There are lots of attributes and it's difficult to keep a close tab on them at just a glance. Just look at this list, how can you easily find one specific skill here? The same goes for comparing stats of items equipped versus those in your inventory, since for some reason they're listed in a fixed, arbitrary way. Even alphabetical order would have made things more accessible, but in my honest opinion, the best way to handle this would be to give them unique colors. That way, you wouldn't be forced to read the ability's name each time you search for it in this epic novel of a list. You'd just instinctively spot it with the corner of your eye. Considering the adequate job they did with making each resource's icon look really distinct, I'm surprised that skills don't have the same quick readability to them. Additionally, there's a leveling system, nothing much to write home about. After your hero gathers enough XP, you get to choose from a limited number of traits to spice things up. The more bosses you defeat, the more special traits are available for selection. Depending on the run, some of them are better than others, but that's okay for a roguelite. And now we get to the meat of a run, populating the map. As I mentioned earlier, the whole purpose of your hero is to rebuild the world around him, and each tile you place goes in that direction. They each have distinct functions and enemies they generate. Even if it's not necessarily a factor of your decision early on, you want to get as many kinds of resources with each run to complete the tech tree in your camp. Thus, a good variety of enemy types is advisable. Later on, when you've got everything built, this becomes a complete non-factor since there's nothing to spend on anymore. Another consequential type of tile is the landscapes. Rocks, mountains, meadows, forests, thickets and deserts all provide passive buffs for your hero. The rocks and the mountains raise your maximum health and get an adjacency bonus if they're placed together. Meadows increase your health regeneration each day, forests and thickets boost your attack speed, and deserts debuff the enemy's total HP. These are all the most necessary things you place in your deck. Not only do they offer hefty boosts due to their adjacency bonuses, but they also force you to make significant consideration as to how you position them to take advantage of some special buffs that aren't obvious initially. They can also provide some downsides. After a specific number of tiles of each type is placed on the map, a unique mob generator is spawned, making things more difficult for you. How you position your own mob generators is also relevant, but not as much as landscapes. And that's mainly because of one that I intentionally omitted until now. It's the river card. It's a late game unlock in the tech tree, so for quite some time in your playthrough you'll be forced to scrounge whatever stat boost you can get. Every equipment upgrade needs to be weighed with considerable attention to avoid losing out on more important stats for your build. For the most part, the game is challenging and many deaths are expected early on because of it. Deaths are a problem because you get to only return with a third of the resources you collected, significantly slowing down the camp building process. It also makes the RNG lottery of your average roguelite important, since the small margins can win you a run if things happen to go your way. But the river washes all that down. This is the part where the deceptions I mentioned before come into light and will never go away from sight again. But what does the river do, you might ask? Well, it doubles the effect of each landscape tile it's adjacent to. If your eyes aren't wide enough already, let me specify that the effect also stacks, so a single tile can double its buff up to 4 times. And if that was still not enough, allow me to inform you that the Thicket card adds a 2% attack speed bonus on its own, making for a potential 16% buff per tile if you place rivers next to it. This ability's ridiculous scaling turns your hero from something between a somewhat average to a relatively strong character into a veritable killing machine that mows down enemies after enemy without breaking a sweat. Once you figure out the perfect layout to maximize the buff effectively, the rest of what you do becomes irrelevant. It doesn't matter what class you have, because they all hugely benefit from the hundreds of percentage buffs to attack speed. It doesn't really matter what skills you use in conjunction with it, since most enemies will be dead way too quickly to matter anymore. The choice of traits on leveling up won't matter too much either, and the same goes for positioning of mob generators. You can simply spam some that generate lots of weaker mobs to farm XP, resources, and increase your chances of getting new thickets and river cards to keep spamming on the map. Everything you've done in the camp matters to the extent of unlocking those 2 cards that make you ball out of control. Essentially, the river turns the game from this challenging fight for survival against formidable odds into a mathematical formula that makes every decision and mechanical depth irrelevant. It's very disappointing, because the effect is not only stark, but it eclipses every other tile placement combination to a ridiculous degree. There's nothing that can beat the over 200% attack speed buff, not by a long shot. In the end, even the fact that it's an auto battler compounds the severity of the issue. It turns a game that at least requires a bit of input into something that plays itself while you brainlessly follow the correct layout for optimum buffs, and thus it becomes boring as hell. At least in the likes of Noita and Risk of Rain, if you managed to break the game with insane stats, which you were not guaranteed to be able to do on each run, you were still in control of your character. You're still doing all that stuff, even if it's a cakewalk. In Loop Hero, you just unpause to witness your hero mop the floor with anyone standing in his way. It's even sadder because it also affects the terrific atmosphere. Sure, the bleak mood was beginning to erode under the weight of all the stats stacking even without min-maxing river and thicket placement, I'm not kidding myself, but this absolutely pummels it into the ground from where it can never recover. It's a shame too, since the plot does a decent job of creating a layer of mystery early on and manages to plant a strong hook into you. The small tidbits of conversation you have paint an intriguing world, and the characters are enjoyable to read even though there's not much dialogue overall. After this scathing past couple of minutes, would I recommend it? Well, for the first 40 hours I had a lot of fun with it. It loses some of its magic towards the end of that interval, but it's a fairly decent return for a $15 title at its full price. The atmosphere is very well done, and the music is an absolutely excellent element without a shadow of a doubt. As I mentioned early on, this is a sort of title you can play during your lazy hours of work, in short bursts, and get a lot of mileage out of it. In this sense, it's definitely worth it, but if you're more like me and want a challenging and mechanically profound roguelite, Loop Hero isn't good enough and definitely not what I'm looking for. And that's all for now. Do the YouTube button stuff to help this channel grow and share this with like-minded friends. And until next time, cheers!